this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Andrew Michaels. Andrew's a really interesting guy. I got to know him about a year ago when he came to work with us. He's also been a supporter of the podcast, and he has a really interesting story. He's a lawyer by trade, and recently he published a paper about the religious use of ayahuasca, specifically in the United States. So we spoke a bit and decided to have him come on because I think it's a really interesting subject. I've spoken about it a little on two other episodes of the podcast. One quite a long time ago, and then one maybe about a year ago. It's an ever-evolving field. A lot of things are changing, and I think Andrew's in a really interesting position in that he actually is a lawyer. It's something he's studied, and he's really familiarized himself with the case law, the case history. It was a really interesting conversation about this subject, which I think is very pertinent in this field, about can ayahuasca be worked with? What is the legality around it? How does it fall under this Religious Exemption Act? Are there people who've been successfully able to do that? Which the answer being now yes. And kind of what is the case law and the case history around that? And kind of also on a bigger topic, what are the implications of that? What does that mean? Why is it important? So I think a really interesting episode. Thank you, Andrew, for coming on, and I hope you enjoy this episode. This is being shot a couple months earlier, so actually even as of now, myself and my colleague, Marav Artsy, are sold out of our next plant medicine retreats. Hopefully by the time this is released, we'll already have our next one open for registration. At the time of shooting this, I'm not sure when or where that will be, but as I said, when this is released, hopefully that will be out. So if you'd like to work with myself, you can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org. There'll be a link to that in the show notes. And on that, we always have our upcoming schedule. Also, if you're on Instagram, you can follow me at my name, at Jason Grachanik, and we always keep that up to date as well with our upcoming schedule. And then, as always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help. As always, thank you very much to the patrons. Thank you for your support. And if you're able to help that way, it's really amazing. It's really built off this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, it's a really amazing way to give back. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers also give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. And then if you're not able to do that, as always, helping with the algorithm. So if you're viewing this on YouTube or Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video. And if you're listening to this on still the big ones are Apple Podcast and Spotify, although I think maybe Spotify has surpassed Apple Podcasts now, leaving a starred rating and a short review is always very helpful. So I think that's it for the intro, and without further ado, here's my conversation with Andrew.
Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for coming on. I think this is an interesting topic. It's one I've covered a couple times on the podcast, but it's really I think, ever-evolving landscape and really goes to some very fundamental questions. And it's about the kind of the legalization or the right to use plants, medicines under the act of religious freedom, of personal freedom. You have a really interesting background. I mean, you studied law, and you've recently written a paper on that. So maybe just to start, you could speak a little bit about who you are, your background, your background in law, and then also what got you interested in this particular topic.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, so I'm a law professor at the University of Houston Law Center, and my primary background or main area of expertise is intellectual property law. But this is not really about that. So, I mean, this is just a topic that I have developed an interest in over the past uh, 5 years or so, and like I try to generally write one major article each summer, and last summer I was um, trying to write another article about intellectual property, but I just didn't really feel like it. It wasn't really flowing. And so um, this is something that I was interested in, that I was just reading a lot about um, anyway. And I realized that there are interesting and sort of unsettled, unexplored legal questions regarding ayahuasca. And so I just decided to write about that instead. And once I started writing about that, not that it was easy, because it wasn't really my main area of expertise. So I had to kind of do more basic legal research on it. But since I was something that I was really interested in, it flowed pretty well, and yeah, so that's how I ended up writing about this.
And what specifically, well, maybe I was going to ask you what your interest in ayahuasca was, but maybe even before that, what was your interest in law? Why was that something you found yourself studying?
Yeah, I mean, so I was an engineering major in undergrad, and I worked as a software engineer for a couple years, and just kind of I don't know, I just wanted to do something different. I just didn't really, it was hard for me to see myself like working as a software engineer for much longer. And so I just kind of wanted to learn something different and new. And law also would allow me to some extent, also still use my technical background if I were to do like patent law, which is what I ended up doing. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that was really just the big thing. It's just something I found interesting in general, and it was new and different. Uh, and then I did work as a patent litigator for a while before going into teaching. So I practiced for about like 5 years or so before going into teaching.
And then when did the interest in ayahuasca come and how did that come about?
Yeah, so I think the first time that I heard about ayahuasca was probably like 15 years ago, and I was watching the show Weeds, and there was one episode, like it wasn't a big part of the show at all, but there was one episode in like somewhere, maybe in the third or fourth season or something like that, where they did ayahuasca, and I think that one of the characters said it's like 10 years of therapy in one night, which is something that people sometimes say about it. I'm not sure that's exactly true necessarily, but I heard that and it sounded, I just remember like kind of being struck by that as something that I felt like would be helpful for me. And because, I've always kind of felt like I had some sort of deep issues that I needed to deal with, but therapy didn't always, I've tried it, but it, sometimes doesn't seem that helpful for me. Like it doesn't seem like it's really getting to the core of the issues. And so that just struck me as something, it kind of stuck in my mind. But after that, I forgot about it for like 10 years. I didn't even remember what it was called. I didn't remember that it was called ayahuasca. But then maybe five, 5 to 10 years ago, maybe it sort of just started to work its way back into my awareness. Like I just kind of kept meeting various people who would kind of introduce me to someone who was connected with it. Um, and and really during the pandemic, I was listening to a lot of podcasts, exploring new podcasts, and I was listening to a podcast by James Gesso about psychedelics, and one of the episodes he had Carlos Tanner on, who is the founder of the Ayahuasca Foundation in Peru, and also like is someone who was kind of relatable to me because he's from Massachusetts, which is where I'm from. He went to like UMass, which like a lot of my friends went there. So he just seemed like a pretty relatable person for me. Maybe was kind of a good messenger for me. And yeah, that I think really, and I just was really interested in, what they were talking about in that episode. Um, and so that kind of really recaptured my interest in it. And I think it was maybe like kind of the right time for me. And then I did, yeah, end up going to Peru a couple times and working with the medicine there. Um, so yeah.
Writing this paper, I'm sure one of the things you had to do is kind of to look at the legal framework and classification of these things. I know it's a kind of a big subject and a big question I'm going to ask, but could you, from your understanding, could you maybe give a little bit of the legal framework behind a bit about the history of government regulation of substances? Why are these substances regulated in the first place? I mean, that wasn't always the case. That came about at a certain time. Why they were regulated, like under what pretense they were regulated, what exactly, like how did that come about? What was that, or what is that regulation? Just maybe a bit for the audience of an overview of how these things or how these substances like ayahuasca originally became regulated, why, how, like what that process looked like.
Sure. I mean, so ayahuasca is regulated under the Controlled Substances Act as a Schedule One substance because it contains DMT, or at least the brew of ayahuasca with the companion leaf contains TMT, and so yeah, and so it is basically prohibited under the Controlled Substances Act. Currently, um, I didn't really, get too much into like the history of the Controlled Substances Act in my research, but more focused on kind of the religious exemptions to it. And so, I mean, and so that, that you might think is under constitutional law, and it used to be, but actually currently it's not. It's under statutory law under an act that was passed in 1993 called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA. And so the way that happened was that so it used to be that the courts did interpret the First Amendment, freedom of religion, as allowing people to have exemptions to these sorts of neutral laws of general applicability that if the law even if the law didn't particularly target any sort one religion. So like if of course if a law is actually like specifically targeting a particular religion, then that is going to be unconstitutional as violating the First Amendment. But um, it used to be that even if a law was just sort of general, not particularly targeting any one religion, such as the Controlled Substances Act is not, aimed at any particular, at any particular religion necessarily. Um, but if the application of it happens to burden someone's religion, then courts um, would essentially conduct sort of a balancing test of like balancing the burden on this person's exercise of religion against kind of the government's need to impose this general law on society. But then in a case in 1990 called Employment Division versus Smith, um, the Supreme Court basically changed the law on that as far as constitutional law and decided that we're not going to do that anymore. Um, and that case actually involved the denial of unemployment benefits to Native Americans who were using peyote. Um, and But more generally, the Supreme Court in that case just said it's too hard for courts to try to balance each person balance like society's need for a general law against each person's particular beliefs and whether those beliefs are religious or not. And so we're just not going to do that anymore. And so they said that religious beliefs can no longer provide constitutional exceptions to these neutral laws of general applicability, as they called them. Um, but So there was some, public outcry in response to that, and Congress at the time disagreed with it, and in 1993, Congress passed this act called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which basically just restored the law back to what it had been before that case, but uh, no longer in constitutional form, but now in statutory form. So the um, the practical implication of it being statutory now rather than constitutional is that Congress could potentially change it if they decided to. Whereas if it's a constitutional issue, then only the Supreme Court can change it. But what this act says is which is currently the law, is that the government cannot substantially burden any particular person's sincere exercise of religion unless doing so is necessary, basically, to further a compelling governmental interest. So it's essentially this balancing test that courts really have the primary responsibility for conducting on a case-by-case basis. Although to some extent the DEA is trying to get involved in administering that as well. But one thing that's important to understand under this framework is that the question isn't, is ayahuasca exempt or not? It's is a particular use of ayahuasca exempt or not? So it's based on each particular person's beliefs and whether the using any particular substance is religious for them or not. So like if a company were to try to start selling ayahuasca in like a grocery store or in a regular bar, I think they would have a pretty hard time arguing that that's religious. But on the other hand, groups that use it in kind of a more traditional ceremonial setting, treating it as a sacred, more of a sacred thing. They have I think a very strong case for an exemption under RFRA, and some groups have. I think at least 5 groups so far have gotten exemptions to use ayahuasca under this statute. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I don't know.
Sorry, I think I was muted there for a second. So does that mean every case needs to be arbitrated individually? I mean, and that balance is always going to be something that the courts look at. I mean, like for example, I believe with the Mormon Church, the idea of polygamy. I mean, that was something that was practiced with them, and yet, from my understanding, the court ruled that goes against. How would you put that? Like a national law or something that's viewed that's not in the public's interest. Therefore, they were able to outlaw that particular aspect of their religious freedom.
I mean, I guess I'm not particularly, familiar with the laws around polygamy, but but to answer your basic question, I mean, essentially, yes, it does mean that it has to be judged on a case by case basis, ultimately in the courts. Although, I mean, there are precedents. So, like, if the Supreme Court were to decide, that ayahuasca use was religious in a particular circumstance, then I think um, that would give people a pretty good idea that other groups using it in the same type of way would probably be found to be religious as well. But ultimately, yeah, it does have to be done uh, on a case by case basis, which is sort of what part of why the Supreme Court overruled it in that case in 1990. I mean, I think there is, some force to their point that that's kind of it's kind of almost like a lot to ask the courts to do, and it's kind of almost like, potentially a big loophole in any law if people can potentially get out of it um, by saying that it burdens their religious beliefs. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I'm just saying that, you kind of see the point that was being made there. But but yeah, I mean, I think certainly there's strong arguments on the other side, and I think that's why Congress did enact that regime to reinstate that balancing. Um, and yeah, I mean, I can talk about some of the groups and the groups that have received exemptions so far, and maybe that would sort of flesh out the sort of things that courts look at. So, I mean, the first one was the Unio do Vegetal Church, and their case actually did go to the Supreme Court in 2006. And
Actually, sorry to interrupt. I mean, before that, I'm not sure of the exact timeline, but before that, would the Native American church and their use of peyote fall into that category, or did they already? Do you know? Did they already have an exemption because they were maybe operating outside of the federal jurisdiction, given their kind of special circumstance? Or are you familiar with that
yeah,
at all?
I'm not super familiar with that, but I believe they do have kind of a special exemption. I think there is like a special act that Congress passed specifically as to Native American usage of peyote. So I don't think they are necessarily getting that exemption under RFRA. But yeah, I mean, so the Unio de Vegetal case, in that case, actually, the government did not challenge whether the use was actually religious or not. They kind of conceded the point that, okay, we concede this is religious, but we still think we should be able to regulate it because it's necessary to further a compelling governmental interest. And the interest that they set forth was one, the safety of the participants, and two, um, the concern that the ayahuasca could get diverted from the group to like being sold on the streets or something. And the court rejected both of those arguments, looking at some studies and some testimony that the group actually had a pretty strong record of safety, and that they also did a pretty good job of keeping um, the ayahuasca secure, and it wasn't getting out into the public. Um, so that was the first group. Although, it's important to note that that didn't actually decide the question of whether the use was religious or not, because the government conceded that point. Um, but then in another case in 2009, the Santo Daime Church got an exemption. That case didn't go to the Supreme Court, but that was decided by lower courts. And in that case, the government did argue that the use was not religious, but the court said that it was. The court didn't do like a ton of analysis on that, but just sort of said that clearly it's like central to their religious practices, and then also similarly rejected the arguments that it wasn't that regulation of it was necessary to protect the safety and to keep the ayahuasca secure. So so those are the two court decisions that have resulted in RFRA exemptions. Um, and after that, the DEA sort of stepped in. And so in 2009, the same year as the Santo Daime case, the DEA created this process by which groups could apply for exemptions under RFRA, but they weren't very responsive to applications. There were a lot of sort of problems with the process that they created. So they weren't very responsive to applications. They had never actually granted one until this year, to the 2025, just in May. They finally did grant one for the first time. But, from 2019.
Do you know, was that the Church of the Eagle and the Condor that they granted that to?
No, that was actually the Church of Gaia, I think a group in Washington State. So the Church of the Eagle and the Condor, though, actually did become the third group to get a RFRA exemption in 2024. But they did not engage with the DEA's. They didn't go through the DEA's process. What they did instead was just sue the DEA and the government in court, which is what a lot of groups were doing because the DEA was so unresponsive in their process, and because they had never actually granted an exemption through that process, and because there was no guarantee that they weren't going to prosecute you during, while your application was pending. So essentially what it required was for groups to disclose their prohibited activities to the DEA, with no guarantee or timeline as to when that petition is going to be resolved. And it also put them in kind of a double bind because, if they were to continue their practices during the petition, then they're potentially open to prosecution, or during the application, they're potentially open to prosecution. On the other hand, if they were to stop, then they potentially open themselves to an argument that, oh, well, it must not really be central to your religious practices if you're able to stop it so easily. So because of that, the general consensus in the space seemed to be that it's better to just sue the government in court and let the courts decide the issue rather than going through the DEA process. And so that's what the Church of the Eagle and the Condor did. And then they eventually settled their case with the DEA. So it didn't reach a final court decision, but they settled it in, I think, April or May of 2024, and became the third group to receive an exemption. And yeah, I think that's led by Joseph Tafour, who I think you've had as a guest on the podcast. And then the Church of Gaia became the fourth group just earlier this year. And they did go through the DEA's process, but they had not actually started operations yet. So they applied for it, and then they waited until the DEA granted their petition before they actually started operations. So I think that may be the situation where it may make sense to go through the DEA's process, and they seem like maybe they'd be more likely to grant the petition if a group hasn't actually begun operations yet and isn't in a huge rush to do so. Then it may make sense to try to go through their process. But
so sorry. So with the Church of Gaia, if they weren't operating before they applied for it, wouldn't that same logic kind of apply that was applied to Church of Condor, that it must not be very central to your practice if you're not using it?
Yeah, I mean, I think potentially, and I haven't seen like any sort of reasoning that the DEA released as to why they decided to grant it anyway. And I don't think that that argument is necessarily dispositive, and I don't think it should be dispositive, but it is just something that I think courts and the DEA have pointed to before as like, a reason why in support of finding something not religious, I think. And so, um, it's just an argument that is potentially you might open yourself up to, but I don't think it's necessarily dispositive. And I guess it wasn't in the case of the Church of Gaia, or maybe I don't know, maybe they said something like, we're currently practicing in Peru or something like that, but we would like to move to the United States. And so we're going to continue practicing our religion in Peru until we're allowed to move to the United States or something like that. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, how that was treated. Um, but then, and then a fifth group, just a month or so after that, in June of, I believe, June of this year, 2025, the Church of the Celestial Heart became the fifth group to get a RFRA exemption. And they also did it by suing the government in court and then settling their case. So it seems like the pace of groups getting these exemptions is picking up a lot. And I, which I think is a positive development. And another positive development is that the first two groups, Santo Daime and the União de Vegetal, were both sort of linked to Christianity, whereas the three more recent groups, I think, are not. So I think that's a positive development in that it sort of shows that the legal system is becoming more, maybe viewing religion less through entirely, the Western lens, and being more willing to find groups to be religious, even if they are not, you know, sort of some form of a Western religion.
And obviously, with the cases of União de Vegetal and Santo Daime, they have a long use, a long history in Brazil where ayahuasca is legal, it's protected. So there's a long history they can fall back on. As you said, there's safety studies that have been conducted. How does that separate, for example, one of the newer churches that's trying to be formed but doesn't have that history to kind of to fall back on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I mean that is one of the factors that courts have looked at in the past to determine whether something is religious or not, is whether it is of respectable vintage. How old is this religion? Um, but I think they can point to. I mean, I think all three of those more recent groups do, um, to some extent at least, incorporate the traditional, cultural, sort of Amazonian practices and beliefs surrounding ayahuasca, which go back, thousands of years. And so, I think that's part of what I mean by courts not necessarily needing to look at this, maybe being more willing to look at this through a non-Western lens and recognize those ancient beliefs and practices as um, religious as well. And so, I mean, I can talk about sort of the factors that courts tend to look at in determining whether beliefs are religious or not. And so, um, it's a difficult question. Like, there's no clear test for whether certain beliefs are religious or not. Um, but one factor that courts look at is like how fundamental are the beliefs? So, do they touch on sort of the fundamental or ultimate questions of human existence, like people's purpose in life, purpose in the universe, like, the meaning of life, the meaning of death, um, morality, uh, things like that. And so I think that can sort of distinguish maybe like political beliefs. Someone might feel very strongly about, say, being a libertarian, um, or whatever, any sort of political system, but that's not necessarily, I think courts would probably say that's not really a religious belief because it doesn't really get to those super deep questions about, sort of the ultimate questions of life and death. Um, and then, whereas, I think, um, ayahuasca, and the sort of beliefs and practices surrounding it often do, sort of touch on or address those questions. And then another factor they look at is how comprehensive are the beliefs. So it shouldn't be limited to any one particular issue. It should be sort of comprehensive, almost touching on potentially any area of life. So like um, for example, like the Big Bang theory, right, is to some extent, addresses sort of fundamental ultimate questions, right? The origin of the universe. But it's just that like one particular issue. It's not really comprehensive. It doesn't address like questions of morality, of how people should live. So it probably wouldn't be considered religious. Um, Whereas, ayahuasca, again, um, it can it can address really, any area of a person's life, potentially. And then a third factor is what they call the accoutrements of religion. So that's a bit more superficial, but it's just kind of like, does this have some of the characteristics that we typically see for religions? And this is where, courts maybe their Western bias might tend to seep in to some extent, but um, does it have like prayers? Does it have services? Does it have, particular sacred buildings where like ceremonies are held? Is there a particular diet that people are asked to keep? Um, does it include proselytization is one thing that they've looked at, although that has been controversial in some more recent cases. But again, I think ayahuasca, use that is sort of accompanied by some of the Amazonian traditions, I think fares pretty well under this factor as well, in that there are icaros, which could be considered kind of like prayers, icaros that are sung during sacred ceremonies, that are held in particular buildings, like say, Maloka. Um, and certainly there are special diets that people are often, asked to keep, such as avoiding pork and salt, limited salt and oil, etc. Um, and so, yeah, and so those are the basic factors that courts tend to look at. Yeah.
So, in obviously, I guess the main issue with ayahuasca in particular is that it is a controlled substance. It also seems like there's a movement to decriminalize a lot of these substances as well. I mean, even certain states or maybe municipalities within states are decriminalizing those. Do you know how that changes the dynamic? I mean, I would imagine if like let's say for example, I think in Oakland, I believe ayahuasca was decriminalized. Does that mean that someone operating as a church in Oakland is on their local level, like I guess it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't even need to be declared a religion, but that then they would still be subject to the federal laws of the illegality of it.
Yeah, so that's an important point. Yeah, that this really only addresses the federal law. So RFRA, the act I was talking about, does not necessarily protect people from prosecution under state law. It only protects them from prosecution under federal law, although about half of the states have enacted their own, essentially, versions of RFRA. So at least in those states, you would probably have similar protection. But yeah, I mean, if a state completely just decriminalizes ayahuasca, then that's, even better. You could say there's no need to worry about the state prosecution in those localities, but you still potentially could have to worry about the federal, and so you would need the RFRA argument at this point um, to protect from the federal. Um,
And in terms of the federal, I mean, I think at least in principle, the way the United States was designed is that the state power should supersede the federal power, but it seems like there's a lot of precedents to where that's maybe going in the other direction. Is there any case studies or like even theoretical things of, for example, if ayahuasca was legalized in a state and someone was practicing it, whether it's in a religious setting or not, I guess wouldn't matter, but that they didn't have a church or their church didn't receive the federal exemption. Is there case studies where the feds could come in? Do they have authority to come in? Would that only um, matter if, for example, they were crossing state borders, which would be a federal jurisdiction? Do you have any sense of how that would work? I mean, that also, I know during the legalization of marijuana, that was a big topic, for example, in Colorado, but that also wasn't under any sort of religious exemption too. It was just, again, it was legalized so people could use it for their own personal use. But if they did cross the state border, then they would fall in federal jurisdiction as well.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think potentially they could. I mean, so, the federal government does, often enact nationwide criminal laws, and I think they generally do that under the Commerce Clause authority, which is to regulate interstate commerce. And so, but that has been interpreted very broadly, basically to the extent that, if something is like affecting interstate commerce at all, it is considered to be under that power. And yeah, there was a case involving the regulation of marijuana that addressed that. But basically, they held that, even if someone was really only operating within a particular state, if they were having an effect on the commerce of other states, there was still held to be, within the federal government's power to um, to regulate that. Um, but I mean, I think, there are some sort of difficult questions that I think you're sort of getting at, which is that, I mean, yeah, so like what if a group does you know, have a RFRA exemption, but what about people who say were to just go in maybe once or twice and use ayahuasca, right? Like, is it still religious for them? I think um, that's kind of a difficult question. And like the group Soul Quest, which some people might have heard of, they actually applied to the DEA through their process for a petition and were denied. And one of the reasons that the DEA gave was that, um, well, we don't really think it's a religious group because, it's so easy for just anyone to come and go to a ceremony, and they don't have to necessarily like join the religion in order to do that. Um, but I think that's problematic because like if we're saying that, only people who do this like on a regular basis, it's only legal if you do on a regular basis, for one thing, that's I think kind of creating less than ideal incentives. I mean, I don't think we want to necessarily be pressuring people to do ayahuasca over and over again if they don't necessarily want to, just because they think that they need to keep doing it in order for it to be legal. Not that there's anything wrong with people who do use ayahuasca repeatedly, and I know there are good reasons for doing that. For example, if you're like training to be a curandero or something like that, um, for one thing. Um, but I don't think the law should be like pressuring people to um, use ayahuasca more than they want to. So that's one thing that I sort of arguing in the paper is that, even if someone is only using it once, but they're doing it, say once, but doing it in a sacred ceremonial setting, and approaching it with respect, and really taking the time to integrate all the lessons from it. Um, that shouldn't be counted against them for purposes of it being religious. And then another thing that kind of is a difficulty in the kind of religious characterization of ayahuasca potentially is the fact that, like, I was saying that ayahuasca use can touch on sort of like the fundamental questions, or can be comprehensive. It can address morality. It can tell people how to live. But the thing is that its teachings are often, very specific to the individual. So in that sense, it might be seen as different from, a more traditional Western religion, where the teachings are more sort of written down and kind of the same teachings for everyone. Um, of course, people do interpret those differently, even as to, more traditional religions. But, I think with ayahuasca, it's even more subjective, it's even more, particular to the individual. And I think that also, could be pointed to as a reason why it's not religious. Or, as in like the Soul Quest case, well, these people aren't like joining the religion, they're just coming once. You're not showing that they necessarily believe the same things as everyone else. And so that undermined its claim to being religious. But again, I think that is problematic. I mean, I don't think we want to be saying that, everyone has to believe exactly the same thing in order for something to be a religion. I don't think we need to be, that's kind of encouraging this dogmatism, or, um, uh, so that's another thing I argue in the paper, is that courts should just sort of recognize the potentially um, problematic incentives that these create, and be careful about not creating incentives for people to use ayahuasca more than they want to, or also creating incentives for people, where they have to like believe the same thing as everyone else, or creating incentives um, for like dogmatism.
Isn't one of, I mean, maybe I'm incorrect, but isn't one of the, I think, principles of a religion or some of the religious law that you have the ability to practice it alone or in community?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that is true. That is definitely something that the courts, have said in some cases, that it doesn't matter, how idiosyncratic your beliefs are, even if you're the only person who believes it, or, even if the court thinks it's crazy, they're not supposed to hold that against you for purposes of deciding whether it's a religion. But then at the same time, they also have said things like, whether it's of respectable vintage, is something to consider, and whether it's religion or not. In which case, if it's something that you just came up with on your own, that would seem to cut the other way. So, there are a lot of sort of arguably conflicting or inconsistent things that courts have said about that.
And in terms of the kind of frequent use of these, could an argument also be, for example, with iboga, it's often practiced maybe only once in a lifetime. It's an initiatory experience. So could that also be argued with something like ayahuasca, that people are, even if they're only using it once or twice, that it's some sort of initiatory experience into that religion of ayahuasca?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that's a great point. And I think that's something actually that I remember seeing in some of the filings and arguments, I think, in the Church of the Eagle and the Condor case, that I think they described drinking ayahuasca as sort of right an initiatory experience and sort of being initiated into learning from the spirit of ayahuasca, and and then letting that guide you, perhaps throughout the rest of your life, without necessarily even uh, drinking again. Although, of course, people might drink again. So, yeah, and I think with Iboga that would be a particularly strong argument as well. And yeah, I mean that sort of reminds me that, yeah, I mean, so I did watch your podcast with Scott Stanley from the Arizona Hay Assembly, and a bit of an aside, I think he talked about how they did take the approach that the Church of the Eagle and the Condor also took of suing the DEA in court, rather than engaging with their application process. But I think you also asked during that podcast, like, could you do this for other substances potentially? Like maybe like cocaine or and so I think you could. I mean, I think you could argue it for any substance. But I think you would have a more difficult time for some substances than for others. I mean, there is uh, one case where someone was arguing that marijuana, they were exempt for using marijuana under religious freedom, and the court rejected it in that particular case. But I don't think that necessarily means that someone couldn't be successful with that argument. But in that particular case, they said that, well, they're not really, arguing anything like that, anything like that. Really, from a spiritual perspective, the plant is like guiding them and giving them ongoing guidance for how to live, things like that. But I think a lot of the reasons that they gave, would not apply to a lot of ayahuasca use, that's accompanied by some traditional beliefs in that, people generally do say that, they're very much associated with kind of the spiritual plane, and that it is giving people guidance on, ongoing guidance on how to live. But but I think, like, if someone tried to do it with, say, heroin or something like that, I think not that they couldn't do it potentially, but it would be a harder argument, I think. For one thing, because, I'm not sure that there is like this sort of ancient, uh, traditional, practices that are built up around using heroin for like spiritual or healing purposes. So it might be a harder argument to argue that it's religion. And then, kind of on the other side of the balance, I think the government could also have potentially a stronger argument that they, even if it were religion, that they nevertheless have um, better, a compelling need to regulate it or to prohibit it, to say protect the safety of people, protect them from addiction, um, to prevent it from getting out. I mean, there is much more sort of a street market for that particular substance. So, so I think potentially, you could make the argument for any substance, but I think it's easier for some substances than for others. I mean, I think iboga would be an example of one that would have, similarly to ayahuasca, that would have a stronger argument, given that there are sort of ancient historical practices surrounding it, that that it's not something that, for example, people would find addictive in most cases.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine certainly for marijuana, you could find very ancient uses of it too. I mean, even in India, things like bong, there's a lot of, drinking it and religious ceremonies and rites around that. But as you said, obviously that's giving a lot of historical context to something. Do you know, or are you familiar? Is there any case law of someone? I mean, because all of these religions also had to start at some point. I mean, even Christianity, it can be traced to someone at some point doing something new. That this is now new. Jesus is making a religion, or his followers, probably better said, not him, but his followers are creating a religion based on this person, and that allegedly started at a very particular point in time. So previous to that, there wouldn't necessarily have been a history to that. Is there any case law or people trying, and maybe with any success, of saying I am creating a new religion and there is no history, but I have a direct transmission, or something that leads me to want to create a religion around this?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen courts like pay lip service to the idea that someone could do that, like that it doesn't necessarily matter how many other people believe in it. As I was saying, doesn't matter if it's completely like idiosyncratic. Doesn't matter if the court sees it as reasonable. But in practice, I'm not aware of any case where they've actually granted an exemption for that exactly. I mean, there was one case where I think a fortune teller, or there a particular, I forget, a particular locality where there were a lot of fortune tellers had a regulation that was particularly aimed against fortune tellers, saying that they had to like get a license and pay a particular fine or something like that. And one of the fortune tellers, I think, challenged this and argued that this is um, against their freedom of religion. And the court in that case ultimately, I think, decided that it wasn't that it was more of a business for that particular person. I'm not sure that that was the right decision in that case, but that was how the court saw it, that it was more kind of a commercial enterprise for them um, rather than a religion. But I mean, it's a difficult distinction to make, and I think that that is something that the courts should watch out for in the ayahuasca context as well. I mean, like, to the extent that an organization is getting like really big and maybe kind of soul quest, but like even much bigger than that, and really seems to be more sort of geared towards um, just making money. I think that that could tend to undermine its claim um, to being religious. Uh, so
Are there any? I mean, obviously, with ayahuasca, I would imagine that the primary motivation of people seeking the religious exemption is their ability to operate, to actually use what they view as a sacrament. Is the church, or are the courts at all worried about other things? Maybe it's even a two-part question. For the person seeking, or for the person or group seeking that religious exemption, are there other benefits that come with that other than just the ability to use that? And then also on the court side, are they worried about any other benefits? Like, for example, if I'm correct, I think a lot of religious organizations get certain tax exemptions. So is that something that the courts are also thinking about or concerned about, or that's not really of their concern?
yeah, I mean, so that is a potential benefit as well that people can get, although they don't necessarily go hand in hand. So that kind of is something that you have to generally sort of apply for separately with the IRS. Although I think there was one case recently where a group did try to get tax exempt status with the IRS, and the IRS denied it, saying that you didn't go through the DEA's process to get an exemption under RFRA from the Controlled Substances Act yet. And so what you're doing is still illegal as far as we're concerned. And so you don't get the tax exempt status. So, yeah, I mean, I think they are related, but they're not necessarily dealt with always um, in the same case exactly. Um, but I think another issue maybe that we could discuss and that I discuss um, in the research is whether it's better to view this to view ayahuasca basically through the lens of medicine or through the lens of religion. I think it's kind of a difficult question because, people do often approach these medicines seeking healing, right? And, we refer to them a lot of the times as the medicine, right? Or as medicine. Um, but if we were to regulate it as medicine, then it's a totally different set of considerations, right? Totally kind of different standard of safety that we have to engage with. Um, and and so and and so what I kind of think about this is that, I'm not sure that ayahuasca would necessarily be the best fit in the Western medical system, right? I think that, if people were taking ayahuasca in a medical setting, um, that it would probably be kind of disregarding totally the shamanic aspects of it, right? Like I'm not sure that there would be a practitioner there like singing Icaros, that has spent a lot of time dieting and developed relationships. I think all of that shamanic aspect would be kind of disregarded, and I think that would probably be um, to the detriment of it. But I don't think that the two lenses are really mutually exclusive, right? I mean, I think it could be that, if ayahuasca gets approved, makes its way through like the FDA approval process, et cetera, and people were wanting to take it in a medical setting, that could be an option, and it wouldn't necessarily, exclude the other option of people doing it in more traditional settings under religious exemptions.
Do you think that could also be potentially a pathway to legalization too, if the medicinal benefits were seen to, because again, the Controlled Substance Act, I mean, I don't know the exact wording, but I would imagine it's something along the lines of, as a whole, the substance is considered more dangerous than beneficial. But if the substance was to be seen as more beneficial than dangerous and it was legalized, then could that potentially be another avenue towards the ability to use ayahuasca?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so that is another sort of way to be exempt from the Controlled Substances Act is for medical use. But it's just a different, basically totally different process and set of considerations that would be looked at, right? You would basically have to go through like the FDA approval process. You'd have to do like medical studies, um, which is I mean, I think you could say it's like a higher probably level of safety. I mean, they do look at safety to some extent in the religious context, but at the same time, it's not, the government doesn't need to like guarantee necessarily that um, people are always going to be safe in practicing their religion, right? If someone wants to take like a safety risk for purposes of their religion, then to some extent, the view of the law is that they, have a right to do that. Whereas, I mean, that's true to some extent from a medical perspective as well, but I think it's just like a higher level of safety and, effectiveness that has to be shown. But again, that's from the Western medical perspective, and so it is not necessarily considering like the spiritual healing and effectiveness that you would see more traditionally um, with ayahuasca.
And in terms of using ayahuasca as an example, if for these groups, for example, who did get the religious freedom exemption, um, as you said, even though a plant like ayahuasca is often considered, or in the vernacular, this idea of it's a medicine is used, are they limited as to if they can say it's medicine, or are they not allowed to do that? Would it be more similar to other legal medicines, but that are not necessarily regulated, where they're not allowed to make any medical claims? Do you have any sense of that?
I mean, yeah, I think there's still definitely can and do call it medicine. I mean, I've seen in the filings in court, they still refer to it as medicine. I don't think that um, that's necessarily has to be taken as, making like medical claims in the sense that like a pharmaceutical company would be making um, medical claims. But, I think just, given that that is often how it's referred to traditionally, I think it makes sense that they continue to kind of refer to it that way. And that's another point that I sort of argue in the paper is that courts should, although on the one hand, this gets back to what we were talking about before about sort of like, someone coming up with a new religion, right? So, like, on the one hand, we don't want to say that like practices have to be set in stone, right? I mean, if ayahuasca use is moving into a totally new context in the Western world in the United States, of course, it's going to evolve. It always has evolved, and it's going to continue to evolve in this new context. And we don't want to say that like, oh, because someone is doing something new or different, that it's not a religion, that it's illegal because they're changing something. Um, but at the same time, um, I think we do want to give groups credit for, to the extent that they are like honoring and respecting and have learned, the more ancient traditions, um, that, that should be something that courts consider and, should be maybe sort of a thumb on the scale in favor of it being religious to the extent, not that they can't be making, evolutions to that, but to the extent that they have people in the organization, or if the shamans or ayahuasqueros, people serving the medicine, curanderos, whatever people want to call them, have spent time training, you know dieting, in the Amazon, learning for years. I think they should be given credit for that, kind of just the respect for the tradition. um, could sort of further the claim to it being religious, but there's a balance there of also being careful not to prevent these things um, from evolving. And I'm thinking of particularly of the Church of the Eagle and the Condor, and I know that Joseph Tafur did spend a lot of time, in the Amazon, um, uh, learning from a curandero there. Um, but then I guess there's another sort of complication that arises from this, is that sometimes this can open people up to like claims of cultural appropriation, right? Which happened with that particular organization, that they were, talking about, I think on their website, how they, were trained in sort of the Shipibo ways, and then some groups, cultural organizations, um, uh, you know, um, uh, had a problem with that, and said that they were exercising cultural appropriation. So I think that's another tricky issue that can arise with this.
Do you know, has there been any talk or thought that you're aware of, because as of now, every individual organization needs to apply for the Religious Exemption Act. But do you think there would ever be a possibility where something like ayahuasca gets some sort of special status, special legal status as something that is religious, and then the organization wouldn't necessarily need to even make the case that this is religious, but they'd only need to make the case of we're some legitimate source that is using this already determined to be religious substance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could happen. if Congress, since this is all statutory at this point, I think Congress could, pass a statute to that effect. I think though maybe they would be unlikely to do that. I mean, even with peyote, they did that, but I think it was only particularly for Native Americans, right? It's not that anyone can use peyote and it's legal. Um, so, and I think, the issue with that is, then, what if, I mean, do we really want ayahuasca to be sold in like grocery stores, right? Or, or bars? I mean, I'm not even sure that I necessarily uh, would think it's a good idea to do that. And um, not that I'm totally against it, but I'm just saying that, and not that I'm deciding anyway, but, um, but I'm just saying I can see sort of the argument on the other side that, in sort of the environment that we're in sort of the capitalist, environment that we're in, I don't necessarily trust, us as a people to necessarily always, to not just turn it into a commodity that's totally being exploited just for commercial reasons. And I don't think that's necessarily the best thing. So, I mean, I think that, to the extent that religion is interpreted broadly enough and that these exemptions are granted freely enough, I think that the system that we have now is actually not necessarily the worst of all possible systems. I don't think we've necessarily, I think we kind of almost stumbled on it by accident, but it does kind of, prevent the commodification of ayahuasca, or, just the selling of it as a product, um, while still, and encouraging and still allowing, to the extent that it's interpreted, as properly as I would see it, um, still allowing and encouraging the use of it in kind of more sacred ceremonial contexts, with respect. Um, uh, yeah.
You mentioned something interesting that when a case is brought that the group that's seeking the religious freedom, it's like it's a particular use of ayahuasca that they're trying to get exempt from, not necessarily ayahuasca itself. So is that kind of already de facto the government saying like we recognize this already as some spiritual use, but we're trying to find or we're trying to arbitrate to make sure that you are using it in that way as opposed to it not even like I guess the question is like if someone is coming for a case, do you think there's still a need for them to defend ayahuasca as being religious, or has that precedent already been established and it's more they need to prove that they are using it in a religious way?
Yeah. Right. I mean, so I think that basically, yeah, you're thinking about it, I think, in the right way. And that, once there is precedent for the court saying that, at least sometimes, at least when it's used in this particular way, it's considered religious, then I think that definitely like you don't have to like start from square one again exactly, right? You can point to that precedent and say, well, what we're doing is pretty much like that. There's not really any meaningful distinction from between how we're using it and how the courts have already held that it was religious. So yeah, I mean, you still do have to make the case that you are using it in a religious way, but it's definitely much easier to make that case once there's already precedents out there saying that like at least yes, this can be religious in certain circumstances.
Obviously, your paper focuses on ayahuasca, but have you heard about, or are you familiar with any other cases of other things? I mean, we mentioned things like iboga, which I would imagine would be quite similar, um, or maybe peyote or wachuma, maybe some of these other plants or substances that are used in a similar way. Are you familiar with anyone challenging those in the same way?
I mean, I know that that a lot. So, you know, as of I think last year, there had been like 24 applications through the DEA's process, and they had granted none of them. They finally did grant one, but only a third of them were for ayahuasca. So I think a lot of them also were for psilocybin or mushrooms. Um, I think some of them, may have been for like peyote as well. Possibly iboga. But yeah, I haven't really seen a lot of cases on that. But yeah, but I guess one point that I think is worth talking about, since we were just talking about like whether whether ayahuasca could be like fully legal. Um, I mean, I think one thing that could be done is to take it off of Schedule 1, which is the most the most stringent regulation under the Controlled Substances Act, and it's supposed to be for things that have a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use, which is a little bit ironic for ayahuasca, given that it is like considered to be a medicine, it is referred to as medicine that is like one of the most powerful um, medicines in sort of this traditional Amazonian practices, but and
And
also
also in general, not super comfortable for people, not something that they're taking to necessarily enjoy even.
right, not so yeah, certainly not really addictive, right? It's hard to imagine it becoming addictive, right? And that's something that people really, I think, don't understand. Like when I've been talking to kind of like other law professors sometimes about, what are you working on? And I talk about this article and they're like, oh, so you just really like this drug, don't you? And I'm like, it's not, I'm not sure I would even call it something that I like exactly. Like it's not something that I look forward to doing, that it's really, and some of the sources I cite in the article as well talk about it. Like one of them said like ayahuasca is many things, but pleasant is not one of them. Uh,
It's
or
probably
at
how
least
most people view going to church or mass on Sunday.
right, yeah. But but I guess one point that is, worth one thing that's worth pointing out is that the actual ayahuasca vine itself, I believe, is fully legal in the United States because it doesn't contain DMT. Right? It's the companion leaf, the generally like chacruna or chalapanga that would contain the DMT. Um, and and I came across this interesting article in my research by someone named Gail Highpine, which was talking about kind of the origins of that mixture. And what she found in her research was that actually the use of just the vine itself in Amazonian shamanism goes back far beyond the use of the mixture. That the mixing it with a DMT containing leaf is actually I think she found a relatively recent, like within the past maybe 500 years or so. I'm not sure she put an exact date on it. Sort of innovation in ayahuasca shamanism, but the use of the vine went back way before that, and so I think that um, is interesting for a few reasons. I think like from the Western perspective, we might think about ayahuasca as just like orally active DMT, right? That, like, especially at least from like a medical perspective, they would probably look at it as, um, DMT is like the active ingredient. But from the traditional perspective, it's not that way at all, right? It's like the ayahuasca vine, which doesn't even contain DMT, is the more sort of important spiritual force. And that's why the brew is named after the vine and not after the leaf. Um, it's the way she put it, I think, is that the vine is like the book, the leaf is like the candle that you use to read the book. So I think it's something else about the vine. It's something else about the spirit of the vine that contains a lot of wisdom or something, or power, and but it's not the DMT. Um, and I think that's kind of important for people to understand. And then also that it is legal in the United States. And so, if a group wanted to sort of maybe, and I think there are still some Amazonian tribes that do practice without the leaf, that do practice with just the vines. And so, if people wanted to sort of revive or engage in practices without the leaf, just using the vine, I believe they wouldn't have any legal issues to worry about with doing that. And I think it would probably tend to be like a more subtle, um, milder experience, which in a way, at least, although probably would involve a lot of purging still. But um, so, I think that's another thing that's maybe kind of appropriate, that would be, you would have less legal hurdles to deal with if someone wanted. And so I am kind of like, I'm almost a little bit surprised that it's not more common in the United States for people to be just using the vine. Although I guess maybe the reason is that still, a lot of people approaching it in the United States are doing it. Maybe there wouldn't be as much of like a demand for a vine only usage of ayahuasca, that that a lot of people still do view it as kind of like, oh, I want to have a trip or something like that, rather than sort of what you would be getting with a vine only experience.
That's an interesting point. I mean, I would imagine a lot of that is just the predominance of more of the maybe more Peruvian based systems, which especially Shipibo systems, which do use a lot of chacruna or kawa as they call it. But as you said, there are, for example, Colombian traditions where they're using yahe, and the yahe only has the vine. I think they're not quite as popular, well known. But it's also interesting because the vine originally, I think it was called. I mean, even some of the substances in the vine are harmine, harmaline, but they used to be called like telepathine because it was seen that it actually had the ability to be psychoactive. So I think in terms of the right dose, it does produce a psychoactive experience as well. So that is interesting. That's I think an interesting way of looking at it. Are there any other benefits of the religious exemption? Like, for example, I'm thinking, does the religious exemption give you more protection? I mean, let's say there was a ceremony and someone had a bad experience and they weren't happy and they wanted to sue, or God forbid someone did die as maybe a direct or an indirect result. Does that religious freedom give that establishment some more protection, or does that really not matter much?
That's an interesting question. I don't think it necessarily would. I mean, possibly from like possibly I think maybe from criminal prosecution, but I don't think it would necessarily protect them from like a civil suit, for for damages based on harm that might have occurred. Although also I think that, if harm like that were to occur, I think that would make it a tougher argument for them uh, to find that it was a religious practice, because safety is one, or that even if it were, the government would have a stronger argument that they should be able to regulate it anyway, um, to protect the safety of people, because so that is one factor that the courts look at in those cases. But yeah, I mean, if it were a situation where, people really understood the risks that they were getting into, that they, wanted to take those risks anyway for their, religious purposes, um, then I think potentially, you could still argue that it was a religious use, and then I believe that would at least protect you from the criminal laws. I think it's unclear, I think, totally whether how much RFRA applies to civil cases. Uh, so it's not clear that it would necessarily protect you in those sorts of cases.
Are you familiar? I mean, you were speaking about DMT. Are you familiar if anyone has made the case? Because DMT is also something that's produced endogenously within us. Is there anyone who's kind of pointed to that or made the case that, like, why is something that we're taking exogenously but that's produced endogenously within us being made illegal if it's something that already exists that the human being is already producing?
Um, yeah, no, I haven't seen that particular argument being made, but that is, yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, and yeah, I think you could similarly probably, you know, argue that like just pure DMT, smokable DMT would be potentially religious as well. And yeah, that might be an argument to make. Although there's potentially, I think, the response of, um, yeah, but you're taking it in kind of not necessarily in the same dosage that it would be present. But yeah, I mean, I think that sort of argument maybe a lot of maybe goes to like arguments about whether ayahuasca should be legal, should be totally illegal, whether these things should be, whether DMT should be illegal at all, um, and um, I mean, I think there are arguments both ways on that, but it's really not something that I take a strong position on in the paper. In that, regardless, I don't necessarily. I'm not sure, when that would change exactly, but given, just under the law that we have in the United States right now, the religious exemption is um, a very viable avenue for um, uh, legal use of ayahuasca, currently. So, I mean, the approach I took was more just to kind of um, sort of explore the boundaries of that and make suggestions for how that might be shaped in positive ways. But I mean, as far as like full legalization, I mean, I think it is a good point that like I believe it's fully legal in Peru, and I don't think they've had any huge problems as far as, I don't think generally see it just being sold next to beer, in a club or something like that, or um, in a grocery store. It hasn't really been commodified in that way. Although still, I don't know, maybe that's, that like Peruvians kind of have a longer history with ayahuasca. They have more of, kind of maybe a cultural understanding of it, a cultural respect for it that I don't think we necessarily have in the United States. And we were also talking about, in terms of like Schedule 1, how, it supposedly has a high potential for abuse. And it's true I think it's true that it's unlikely, very unlikely to be addictive. Um, and that it does have potential medical use in like a spiritual kind of traditional sense. Although I still might say that it does have some potential for abuse. Not in the sense of addiction, but if people are using it with the wrong intentions, etc., it can be used in harmful ways potentially. If people are using it with the wrong intention, or if people are using it just kind of recklessly, right? Just, without having learned much about it, without having, taken the appropriate sort of training and precautions. I mean, I think it's really striking to me, like, that, in Peru, they have thousands of years of experience with this medicine, and they treat it like with extreme caution, right? They really, a lot of respect. Um, they're not just, it's kind of like they know better than to just take it, uh, in without any preparation, without any training, um, in a setting that's not, not prepared for that. Whereas I'm not sure we necessarily have that understanding in the United States at this point.
Obviously, we've been talking specifically about the United States. Are you familiar with any other countries of the directions they're moving? I mean, I think the Religious Freedom Act is something that's very particular to the U.S. I think other countries may offer some religious protection, but I think in general it's quite less. Are you familiar with any other countries, like maybe Canada or just other maybe Western European countries of any case studies or any directions you see them moving in?
Yeah, I'm not really. I probably should look into that more, but no, I haven't really looked too much at how other countries are treating it. The one thing I did look at a little bit was whether the vine is legal in and so I think some other countries have actually specifically outlawed ayahuasca and the vine, and so the vine wouldn't necessarily, I think, be legal in all other countries, but the approach we've taken in the U.S. is just that it's regulated as DMT, in which case I think the vine would be legal. I don't think that any other substance that's in the vine is included in the Controlled Substances Act.
So after writing this and researching it, do you, I mean, now it seems like there are some exemptions that are being given. What do you foresee as possible trajectories? Do you see that there could be divergent trajectories? I mean, do you have any idea of, after having researched this, a direction that things are moving in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely, the pace of the exemptions definitely seems to be picking up, right? I mean, there was one in 2006, one in 2009, and then and then none until 2024. And then we've had three, since then. So one in 2024, and then two already this year in the first half of 2025. Um, so, I think, and that's, I think, a result of kind of ayahuasca becoming more known and more popular, and, more people wanting to use it in the United States. And also, I think, of um, maybe, the law developing to an extent, and courts being more willing to, um, view non-Western, things uh, as religion potentially. And also, so there was a report that I mentioned in 2024 by the Government Accountability Office, where they kind of criticized the DEA for, having this process since 2009, but not really being responsive, and not having ever granted an exemption. And then the DEA did finally grant one in 2025. So that may be also a sign that the DEA as well, along with the courts, is potentially becoming more open to granting some of these exemptions. So, I mean, it does seem like that is the direction that we're moving in that more and more groups are getting these sorts of exemptions. But I think that is going to eventually, require the courts to make some difficult judgments as to, what qualifies as religious or as protected under this act versus not. I mean, I think generally they should be granted, as long as the groups are kind of approaching it with respect, using it in kind of a sacred ceremonial context. But, I think that to the extent that they're veering more into the like purely commercial or purely recreational, that courts are going to have uh, difficult decisions there. And then I think also some people are, pursuing the medical route as well. It's not something that I've looked at as much, but I think there are medical studies being conducted with ayahuasca and certainly with other substances like psilocybin um, that, may result um, in medical uses being approved and that being another way that these things can be used legally.
Well, this has been great, Andrew. Anything else? Maybe do you want to speak about your paper a little bit, and if people are interested in reading it?
Sure. I mean, if people are interested, it's called Ayahuasca and Religious Freedom. If you just Google that, you should be able to find it on my SSRN page. And yeah, it's accepted for publication with the Pepperdine Law Review, but it's still in their editing process, and it will be. And I don't think it'll be finally published until um, I think like February 2026. So if people did want to read it and they had, comments, they could reach out to me with that, and I could potentially still, make some minor edits to the um, paper. But, I'd just be interested to hear what people think about it in general. So yeah.
Great. Is there anything we didn't touch on with the paper, or just kind of this issue in general that you think is important?
I mean, I guess one other thing is just sustainability is another thing I talk about a little bit that that may also be something that courts want to consider is I've seen sort of conflicting things about how much of an issue that is, but some people are concerned that over, especially as ayahuasca sort of expands, it becomes more and more popular, that we could be like over harvesting the vine. And so that, and, arguably that relates to whether something is religious, because if this is a religious practice, generally we want it to be something that can continue for a long time. And so we want to make sure that um, that the harvesting is being done sustainably. And so to the extent that groups are considering that um, and maybe making efforts to sort of harvest or plant their own vine, that might be seen as bolstering their claim to being religious. I know that it is also sometimes being grown, like in Hawaii, for example, now. Um, so it doesn't necessarily all have to be coming from the Amazon. And and then also, sort of relating to what I was saying, that like they should be given credit for the extent that they are like steeped in the traditions and that they're showing respect or reciprocity to the cultures that have developed this wisdom over like thousands of years. Um, I think to the extent that groups are engaged in reciprocity and are giving back to some extent to those cultures, that should be considered as well. And I think a lot of these groups, the extent that I've looked at their websites, the ones that have received the exemptions more recently, such as the Church of the Eagle and the Condor or the Church of Gaia, they do have sections on their website where they talk about the charities that they are engaged with, um, in efforts of reciprocity, of giving back to the communities that they learned these practices from.
Yeah, I think that's an important topic. Well, this has been great, Andrew. I appreciate you sharing and all your work and kind of wisdom around this subject. It's obviously a big subject, something that's changing quite rapidly, and I think something very important. Obviously, in this field, it's something that's very prescient that a lot of people are aware of or hopefully will be aware of. So I think it's great the work you're doing. I think it's very pioneering, and I wish you the best and hope you continue. And we can share the link to the paper in the show notes. And yeah, if anyone has any input or anything, I think it would be great if they reach out to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, thanks a lot for having me on. I really enjoy your podcast in general, and I've really enjoyed this opportunity to speak with you about these issues. So thank you.
Yeah. All right, everyone. That's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. It's a really interesting topic, very nuanced, very complex. I was also trying my best to follow along. It's something that's very new, so I think there's many directions it can go, but I think ultimately something that's very important. In terms of religious freedom, in terms of our rights, our abilities to live our lives, obviously drawbacks, trade-offs of whichever way this goes, but I think a very interesting and pertinent topic. So that's it. As I mentioned in the intro, if you're interested in working with me, working with plants, doing deep work, experiential learning and healing. At the time of shooting this, we are all sold out, but hopefully when this is released, we will have opened our next retreat. And so you can find that on my website, which is nicotianarustica.org. There's a link to that in the show notes. And then, as always, if you're able to support this podcast, it's really deeply appreciated. I always really appreciate all of the patrons, Patreon supporters, the patrons there. If you're able to join that website, it's really beautiful working off this idea of reciprocity. It really allows me to keep making and producing and editing and everything these shows. There'll be a link to that in the show notes as well. And then, as always, just helping with the algorithm. So sharing this with your friends. If you're viewing this, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, leaving any comments in the comment section. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. So that's it. I hope this finds you all well. Thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you all on the next episode.